Today in the Global African, we'll talk about the Pope's recent visit to the United States. We'll also talk about what's happening in Burkina Faso. That's Today in the Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us, and don't go anywhere. In this segment of the Global African, we have an opportunity to have a dialogue with noted theologian and activist Reverend Graylin Hagler from Plymouth Congregational Church in Washington, D.C. We're going to explore in this segment with Reverend Hagler the recent visit by Pope Francis to the United States and its implications, religious and otherwise. We're also going to touch on something that will be unsettling, which is the threats, including death threats, which Reverend Hagler has received for his outspokenness on the issue of justice for the Palestinians. So stay tuned. We're joined now by Reverend Graylin Hagler, who's the pastor of Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C., and a longtime theologian and activist. And thanks again for joining us in the Global African.
Thanks, Brother Fletcher.
I was really interested in having a discussion with you about the visit by Pope Francis. And I mean, you're not a Catholic, but as both a theologian and an activist, I was curious, what is your summation of the significance of his visit and of him at this moment?
Well, one of the significance of his visit is obviously to introduce himself to particularly the Catholics in North America, and in some ways to deal with all the wreckage that has gone on in terms of sexual abuse by priests and all of that other type of stuff. But also, he's really sort of presenting a liberationist face onto the papacy. And therefore, he's challenging a lot of the traditionalism that exists in North America and even to South America to a great extent. And like for his visit to Cuba was an attempt to try to reclaim a place for the Roman Catholic Church in Cuban society, because it had totally lost its place in Cuban society. So it was a whole lot in terms of introduction and trying to show a fresh face of the papacy, trying to also lift up a liberation theological perspective. I mean, that was the reason he chose a Fiat perfect product placement for Fiat, right? But he chose a Fiat over a limousine, right? I mean, so I mean, whoever heard of someone of that stature getting off the plane and getting into a Fiat in the procession where the SUVs was 3 times the size of the automobile he was riding in, right? But it was a statement. It was a statement that we weren't high and mighty. We were humble, and we had also making a statement to be in solidarity with the poor.
It was interesting listening to his speech to Congress when he was delineating 4 people from the United States that he felt needed to be recognized. One of them was a woman, Dorothy Day, from the Catholic Worker Movement. And I thought that that was very, very significant, and not just because she was a woman, but because she really was part of that a kind of prototype of liberation theology, I think one could argue.
Sure. I mean, she's really an example, a strong example of sort of the Catholic worker that decides to live humbly and to live in the midst of struggling communities and poor communities, and to work alongside people. So that fits in with his whole theological paradigm as he comes out of Latin America. But it's a real challenge also to the traditionalists that really sort of kept the Catholic worker houses sort of more on the fringe rather than in the center of the Roman Catholic Church. And they really got established because people were feeling that the big cathedrals and the way the Catholic Church was being run was not really addressing adequately the types of issues that were on the fringes of society: homelessness, poverty, those types of things.
On the other hand, he had a visit with Kim Davis. What do you think of that issue of religious conscientious objectionism? I mean, looking at the Kim Davis case, as an activist and a theologian, how do you look at that? How do you treat
Well,
that?
you know, I mean, from my perspective, first of all, she has a problem, and that problem is that she is there as a government official, and government officials in the United States should not be partiality towards any religious perspective. They can be partial in their private lives, but in terms of holding an office, they are really subjected to the model of being objective, right? And that you have to serve everyone. You have to serve everyone that the law says you have to serve. If she can't do it, she needs to step down. But what I'm getting at here is that we think, and this is part of the problem with the evangelical community, we think that we're in a Christian country. And therefore, we think that therefore we're supposed to stand up for Christian principles in government. But we're not in a Christian country. We're in a pluralistic society. We're in a government that, by its very structure, very nature, constitutional qualities, that basically says that we should have no state-sanctioned religion.
But where does this come from, Graylin? This notion of this is a Christian country.
It comes from folks really just sort of trying to change the narrative. And you keep saying it long enough that you get more and more of a population that actually believes it. Case in point, right? Majority of Trump followers believe that Obama is not a Christian and Obama was not born in this country, no matter what evidence you put forth.
Right.
And outside of that is almost 47% of the Republican electorate that believes that he's a Muslim and that he was not born in this country. Right. And so what I'm getting at is that people can buy into falsehoods because one, is convenient for them. I've been doing this training in Annapolis with clergy, anti-racist training. And so there was a whole thing where there was one of the resistance to when they were bringing slaves off the boat in Annapolis, Maryland. They were evangelists there. Right? Because basically the state charter at that point said that if you were a Christian, you couldn't be enslaved.
Right.
Right? So then they changed the state charter to say that ain't no person who's a slave or black can be Christian. Right? So they changed the whole Christian thing dependent upon economics, dependent upon convenience, dependent upon political empowerment. And so it's a ruse. It's a ruse of smoke and mirrors.
You know, when we invited you to the Global African this time, I hadn't planned on asking you about this, but events just sort of moved at a certain pace. You found yourself in, and this is shifting gears, you found yourself involved in quite a controversy recently with threats to your life because of your stand on Palestine. Right. And I'd appreciate if you could say a little bit about what happened.
Sure. I was invited actually by two groups. One was Colgate Rochester Crows Divinity School, and a group called Christians Witnessing for Palestine to come and speak on Palestine. And the issue was from Ferguson to Palestine, connecting the dots. That's what I was to speak on. And as we got close to the date, I got couple emails, but one email said, "Can't wait till you get to Rochester so I can spit in your face," and quoted to me from Genesis. And then I got some calls, nasty calls, threatening calls. One call particularly said, "I'm from Christians United for Israel, and as soon as you get to Rochester, we're going to blow you away in the name of Christ." And so you talk about theology. Here's the Christian nation for you again, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So the real perverted idea of theology, they're going to blow me away in the name of Christ. So we did go to Rochester. Instead of having one speaking event that was canceled, we had two that were full houses and had good amount of coverage in the Rochester paper on the subject, and even some commentary that came out on Sunday from a Jewish perspective and a Christian perspective. But what we really see is this whole framework of intimidating and browbeating and name calling that takes place around the whole issue of Palestine.
Tell us about that. I mean, how did you come to that conclusion? Why didn't you just say, well, it's just not worth it? I mean, I have many other things I could be doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's something in my own personality, if I can put it that way, and that I would not have probably responded in such a way if you told me I couldn't come. Mm-hmm. Right? If I mean, the fact that you said I can't come because you're gonna kill me, or you're gonna beat me up, or you're gonna spit in my face, right? Makes me say, H no, hell no, right? I'm coming, right? So you come with whatever you got. And that's a part of my spirit. I mean, I think we know a little bit in terms of our own past, in terms of places like Boston, that you don't shrink from a fight, because once you shrink from a fight, you're shrinking from a fight forever. That's right. Once you start, it doesn't end. And the reality is that the folks who picked the fight, Rock for Israel, actually had the audacity to email me on Wednesday night before I was to speak on Thursday, asking now if I can intervene with the media and tell the media that they weren't that bad and that they didn't issue a threat against me.
You're kidding. Really?
Oh, yes. Right. I mean, so the fact that told me at that point that we had kicked their butt.
Yeah.
Right? Because they were surrendering. They were asking me, the person who was the villain, the person that they had called the anti-Semite, the person that they had called anti-Israel and all that other type of stuff. Now they're asking for me to help them with the media, because the media looked at it.
The Pope has taken steps towards the canonization of a Franciscan priest,
Sure.
Junipero Serra. And there's an immense amount of controversy around this.
Yeah.
And one thing that I discovered, I didn't realize, is the controversy is not new. It's just, there's a controversy now, but the controversy is really long-standing.
Right.
And about his role and the role of the Franciscans in the settling of the Southwest.
Right. Well, let me preface that by saying that the Native American communities from those areas, when the Pope came to D.C., asked to use my church for their press conference to decry the canonization of Serra. And of course, we allowed that to happen, right? Again, sort of standing in solidarity with people.
Right.
And I think it comes back to the same thing, right? It's a mixed bag. We throw the traditionalists some things. We offer some traditional things. But we also got to remember that this Pope is of that institution that's largely conservative. That institution that has basically resisted every revolutionary struggle in the country until they had to eventually succumb to the revolutionary struggles in the country. And as I point out, that's what Pope going to Cuba is all about, right? Because Cuba is largely Protestant today, because there was basically a lid that was put on the Catholic Church for their resistance to the revolution, and they're siding with the oligarchies of Cuba. And that has been the case very often in many of these places, like even Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez was there. He came up against the apparatus of the Catholic Church. And so again, it's sort of like that's the traditional core of the church that has not yet transitioned. You have a Pope that's raising some other issues and trying to move the church in some different ways, but still there's that core that exists.
Reverend Hagler, as always, a real pleasure having you.
Thank you, brother.
Appreciate it.
Good to be here, Brother Fletcher.
Always. And thank you very much for joining us for this segment of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll be back in a moment. After experiencing a military coup carried out by members of the Regiment of Presidential Security, Burkina Faso President Michael Kafando is back in power. The Regiment of Presidential Security has been accused of acting in the interest of Blaise Compaoré, former president of that Central African nation. Compaoré was removed from power during the Burkinabe uprising of October 2014. Leader of the coup, former Chief of Staff Genera Diendere, has publicly apologized to the country. Diendere is willing to surrender to authorities, saying, quote, "I am willing to turn myself over to face justice. I would like the people of Burkina Faso to find a solution to this crisis through dialogue. All parties must talk to find an inclusive solution for the future of the country," unquote. Although Diendere has surrendered to the interim government, the Presidential Guard has continued their rebellion. This is what we're going to explore in this segment of The Global African. We're joined now by Frank Charnas, who is the co-founder and CEO of Afrique Consulting Group. Afrique Consulting Group is a sub-Saharan Africa-focused consultancy. And I want to welcome you very much to The Global African. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to look at the situation in Burkina Faso, and it would be helpful if we could start with some basics. It's a Central African nation, and there was most recently a coup. The coup was defeated, but I'd appreciate if you could give us a little background on where did this coup come from? What happened?
Okay, well, originally Burkina Faso, which is one of the poorest nations in West Africa, was ruled by a man called Compaoré for 27 years. Blaise Compaoré. Compaoré met his end in October last year with a popular revolution led by a civil organization called the Citizens Brew. Following that, a leadership came into being that was tasked with taking the country through transition into elections in October this month. This leadership was not democratically elected. They came into power following the popular revolution, but had popular support. They were led by two people, a prime minister known as Isaac Zida, who was originally a soldier in the Presidential Security Regiment, or the RSP, and a president by the name of Michael Kafando. Now, the RSP were linked to the Compaoré regime and remained very, very powerful even after his regime ended. It appeared that they were about to lose their influence, and through democratic elections, the power networks, the patronage structures that have been in place for the last 28 years were ultimately going to fall. And it's my belief that the imminent end of these patronage networks and the potential that the RSP were going to lose their power and their position within the society itself is probably what led to a coup led by General Diendere.
The coup was ultimately defeated, and what would you identify as the main factors that contributed to the defeat of the coup?
I believe that there are three main elements that contributed to the defeat of the coup. Firstly, there was a lack of popular support. The RSP thought that, or the peers of the RSP didn't realize that the population were against them and that the leadership was unpopular amongst the general population, and so the population rose up in protest. Secondly, I believe that the RSP didn't envision such a robust African Union and ECOWAS, the West African Economic States Organization, such a robust reaction from them. And thirdly, I believe that the response of the army in rising up to quell the coup and in being prepared to march on the capital Ouagadougou and to stop the coup is potentially what also led to the ultimate quelling of the coup and the ultimate failure of the coup.
In the context of the uprising of October 2014, the name and image of one Thomas Sankara reemerged. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about who Sankara was, and do any of his ideas have any continued relevance to the situation facing Burkina Faso?
Okay. Sankara is considered to be one of the godfathers of the African liberation movement, and he occupies a certain, almost a Che Guevara-esque image both within Burkina Faso and throughout Africa. In fact, certain elements of his ethos, certain elements of his dress even have been copied throughout the continent. In South Africa, for instance, a party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, wear red berets, which is a homage to Sankara. He was murdered in shady circumstances, and many people believe that Compaoré, the old president, and Diendere, the general who launched the last coup, were linked to his death. And I believe that because of his ethos and many of the things that he believed in, he was a socialist, that follows through today, and that continues to be very strong and a very strong pulling ideology for the people, for the Burkinabe people, for the people of Burkina Faso, but also throughout Africa on a whole. As Sankara occupies a revolutionary figure across Africa.
Who organized the uprising, the insurrection, and to what extent the forces that organize that have been pursuing some sort of transformational effort in Burkina Faso. Because one of the things that we've seen is in Africa and other places is the successful overthrow of dictators, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a revolution, if you see what I mean.
Yes, I do, and I believe that there are certain explanations for that. The original revolution was headed by a mixture of organizations, an organized opposition, as well as a civil society group known as the Citizens' Broom, who were able to pull the masses onto the streets. Also, there was a large element of unemployed and poverty-stricken youths who took part in the protests and who gave the protests mass and direction. Mm-hmm. With regard to the second point that you made about how some revolutions end back in a dictatorship and other revolutions don't, I think that Burkina Faso demonstrates something very interesting. At the time of the revolution, the old guard of the RSP, the presidential security regiment, remained powerful. The party that had brought Sankara to power and Sankara's party remained within the society, and I'm sure many of Sankara's supporters remained in society and were in Burkina Faso. And so the government was faced with a problem, and all revolutionary governments are faced with this problem, how to deal with the old regime. And I think that possibly maybe the failure to deal with the old regime is what led to the secondary coup. Mm-hmm. But it also, I don't think that there is a correct way to do it. I don't think there is a correct answer. Zida and Kafando, the two leaders of the government, of the transitional government, while they did take steps to quieten down the RSP and to disempower them, and they attempted to not allow Kampare's supporters to stand in elections, they nevertheless decided to go with an ECOWAS ruling that said that Kampare's supporters should be allowed to stand in the elections, and they nevertheless allowed for the continuation and for the survival of these people and for the survival of the patronage networks, the networks of power that had kept Kampare in office for 27 years. So I think that this particular factor might be what led to the secondary coup, but the popularity of the original revolution and the dislike of the RSP and the dislike of the old guard, the vestige of the last guard, is what ultimately led to the overthrow of the coup.
Final question. In looking at the future, what do you see as potential scenarios for Burkina Faso?
Well, on Thursday, yesterday, election observers arrived from the EU to see whether it was still possible to hold elections on the original date. I believe that we will see elections there. I hope that we will see elections there, possibly on the 11th of October, which was the originally slated date. Burkina Faso has a long way to come. It's going to the government that takes over is going to be left with many, many problems. They're going to have to improve an economy. They're going to have to deal with that old guard, that old Kampare old guard. They're going to have to deal with the place of the RSP within the society and within the government. And ultimately, they're going to be tasked with being the first properly democratically elected government in nearly 30 years. So Burkina Faso on a whole is very, very, very difficult to predict. It continuously throws curveballs. It continuously, the trajectory it takes is different from that which everybody believes it will take. But it has a very strong civil society, and as we know, democracy is more than just elections. It's about civil society. It's about freedom of speech. It's about freedom of movement. It has a very strong civil society. It appears to be very excited and ready for elections. And so hopefully the future will bring stability to Burkina Faso.
Frank Charnas, thank you very much for joining us for The Global African.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And thank you very much for joining us for this episode of The Global African. Hope you enjoyed the program. Look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.